The Capitol chambers here in Connecticut are ready for new proposals as lawmakers head back for the 2024 session. But before they start, what are they going to prioritize? We're breaking down potential new laws and the issues impacting you with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. But first, back from the first presidential primary in the country, a Connecticut college student has insight to share when it comes to candidates, campaigns, and what voters want. We're talking all about Quinnipiac's trip to New Hampshire to be part of the election process, ahead on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. The first presidential primary has come and gone. The race to the White House is now quickly changing as campaigns pick up the pace or lose steam. While Connecticut's primary isn't until the first Tuesday of April, New Hampshire voters got to celebrate their first in the nation status yet again, casting their ballots this past week. But college students from our state still got to take part in the process. Political science professor Scott McLean has been taking students to the first presidential primary every 4 years since 2000. From the contentious election between Gore and Bush to a now completely unique race with former presidents, legal challenges, and changing campaign technology and media. Professor McLean telling me before they left, this trip is everything he could ever hope to teach in action.
Giving them an opportunity to really see what a grassroots get out the vote effort starts to look like, which you can only really see in New Hampshire on primary day. The most exciting of all of the primaries would probably have the highest amount of voter interest, informed voters. They have a long tradition in New Hampshire of having voters that really pay attention to the candidates, and they're very secretive about who they will vote for. So many times, voters in New Hampshire will say, I'm not telling you who I'm going to vote for. I haven't met them all yet.
And meet those candidates these students did, along with New Hampshire's voters. Here to talk about it all with me now is Nick Fazziano, political science and history major, president of the Quinnipiac Democrats and class of 2026. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me today.
So what got you into all of this? What made you decide to study and pursue political science in school?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been something I've always been really interested in. It really came out of a love for history and seeing how politics really is just history coming up before our very eyes, and seeing what policies affect people and seeing how the government really does have a massive impact on folks' lives.
You spent 6 days in New Hampshire really making the most of it. I want to start with a specific moment, though. Big news coming Sunday as you were at an event, Florida Governor Ron Desantis dropping out of the race, and you had asked him just days before if his campaign was sustainable. So tell me about that. How did that all go down, and what was that like to experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the event with Governor DeSantis himself, he was talking a lot about how he was going to bring Republicans down ballot up with him. And seeing as he was polling in single digits, lower than Chris Christie when he was still in the race, that seemed deeply implausible to me. And so I asked him. And of course, it was very interesting to see just 2 days later, my hunch had turned out to be correct.
We heard Professor McLean say how in New Hampshire you really get to meet, talk with, and spend time with these candidates from big campaigns to small. You all took part in that, what they call diner culture and voter events. Did any of the candidates surprise you? Were there any conversations that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think candidates specifically I was more or less aware of. But as far as surrogates went, I think Chris Sununu was really interesting. It almost felt like him and Haley were very much a tight team, with Haley acting as the Southern candidate and Sununu being her home base bulldog, and he was very excited. He was very happy, and you could really tell he was enjoying it greatly while still acting as really Haley's happy warrior.
And you're obviously president of Quinnipiac Democrats, but you were embedded in all different campaigns in New Hampshire, from progressive to conservative and everything in between. You've even said Donald Trump's town hall was one of your trip highlights. What do those moments and those voters teach you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to understand that folks are just the same as you, irregardless of political party. For the most part, we all do want the same things, and it's just a matter of what rhetoric people listen to and what they buy into. I'm obviously not a massive fan of former President Trump, but his rally was certainly the most interesting from a psychological perspective, but also from the perspective of seeing people who politically behaved so wildly differently from me.
We've heard a lot of voters and, frankly, non-voters say they're kind of disappointed in the choices or lack thereof. President Biden won the Democratic primary as a write-in candidate. Former President Donald Trump, who you just mentioned, winning the Republican primary. You know, what's shaping up to possibly be a very familiar matchup. But you spent a lot of time with campaigns fighting for a chance. Dean Phillips, Marianne, Williamson, even Nikki Haley, who's still in the race. Talk to me about those campaigns and what you saw them trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to run through each of them, Marianne Williamson's campaign really rung true to her last campaign in 2020. It's a campaign of very progressive ideals, and she paints herself as the champion of the youth and the champion of the New Deal. I didn't really experience that from her. It was obviously what she was aiming at, but to me, she felt like an antiquated candidate. She made lots of mentions of the 70s and President Nixon and going back there. It really did feel like she was running a campaign for the Democratic nomination in 1972 as opposed to 2024. Dean Phillips, his campaign is probably the most difficult for me to understand. His voting record is 100% in line with the president's, and his only real big difference seems to be he is younger. Phillips has also, during the course of this campaign, changed a number of his policies, just a month ago coming out in favor of Medicare for all, while still saying he is not a proponent of a single-payer health system which abolishes private care, exactly what Medicare for all is. So he struck me as a very disingenuous candidate. And Nikki Haley's campaign, I think, really did represent the old guard of the Republican Party, the optimism and the traditional conservatism of the Reagan era, the Bush era. And it seemed very different from this new populist wave that's taken over the Republican Party. It really did seem between Haley and Trump as a clash between populism and true conservatism.
You mentioned age and youth, specifically with Phillips and Williamson. In New Hampshire and across the country, voters have said age really matters to them. They're looking for younger candidates. It's become a huge conversation on Capitol Hill and in these campaigns. As a young person yourself, especially in the political world, do you see this changing elections? Do you think these younger, smaller campaigns get a starting chance?
I believe in a different environment, absolutely. I think in this environment, Donald Trump is running as a quasi-incumbent in the Republican primary, and President Biden is running as the incumbent in in the Democratic primary in 2024. And it's very interesting to see that real discontent about age being clashed up against with reality. I think in 2028, you'll likely see on both sides much younger candidates. I think you'll see Gavin Newsom, you'll see Nikki Haley again, and I think it will represent a new age of politicians coming onto the national forefront.
Yeah, and you've pointed out how drastically campaigns have changed. I mean, you were saying, which I thought was interesting that specifically with Phillips, Williamson, and even with Haley, their campaigns have kind of seemed to be a callback to some from years ago. But obviously the political sphere and how these campaigns are run is really different than what we saw years ago, from door knocking to rallies, and obviously now social media plays such a big role. How else did you experience this kind of new campaign in New Hampshire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things, I didn't personally experience this, but this happened while we were in New Hampshire, was I believe it was the night before the primary, a robocall went out to Democratic voters with a deep fake voice of President Biden telling them to not vote in the primary and to instead save their vote for November. And I think that's a really interesting turn of technology. And I think historically you've seen as every candidate is greeted with a new technological atmosphere, those who best understand it are those who do the best, whether it be Roosevelt with radio, Kennedy with television, Barack Obama with social media. New technological advances have a massive edge in these political campaigns. And if you find out how to really take that advantage, you have a great head start.
For you as a young voter, is that concerning at all to you that we have access to things like deep fakes and AI and the way we see campaign ads and messages in the media to voters changing?
Absolutely. I think in this very polarized political sphere, you're only going to see that disingenuity and that dishonesty come to a much larger head. It's no longer a candidate lying about their opponent's position. It's now making it seem as if the candidate themselves are lying about their own position. And you really have to be able to take apart what is honest and what is dishonest. And that's very difficult, particularly for folks who only pop in and out of campaigns. It's going to become a really large challenge.
Yeah. And obviously, though, overall, an incredible experience to speak with candidates, campaign workers, and voters. New Hampshire's turnout is always good. They're engaged, they ask questions, they vote. So before we go, last thing here, what's your message to people as someone yourself who is obviously very engaged in the political world, but we see a lot of people, especially young people, being disengaged? Any message or anything you would say to your peers or even older people about why you think they should either get or stay engaged in the 2024 races?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every race, you always hear it, every race is the most important of our lifetime, but every race is, particularly as we become more polarized. Politics do matter, and it does shape your life as an individual. Even if you don't pay attention to politics, what happens in your state legislature, what happens in your city hall, what happens in Congress will affect you. And it's very important to stay engaged, particularly as this election could really mean a turning point for our democratic experiment.
Well, Nick, thank you so much. That's all the time we have, but some great firsthand insight and experience there. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And we'll be closely covering the race for the White House in 2024 and all the rest of the 2024 elections. But before Connecticut can vote in our primary, the big political story here, the upcoming session. What can we expect to get done, and what legislative priorities do communities have for their representatives? We're talking big issues and proposals next with Connecticut's Conference of Municipalities.